Good morning, everybody.
Morning. Morning.
All right. Good to have everybody here with us today. Let me make some announcements for the Historical Society. Heritage Village is open every Sunday from 2 to 5. If you don't know where the Heritage Village is, it's down on Old Main Street and West Lock Street. So we've got some great programs going on down there. The History Center will be open this afternoon as well as on Wednesday afternoons from 1 to 4. Our military banner program is still open, and I want to thank everyone here. Have anybody here bought a banner for the military? Thank you to everybody for supporting so enthusiastically the Veterans Banner program. We've sold, I think it's 125 so far. So if you have a question about buying a banner, the answer is yes. You can still buy one. We will still display it. We want to recognize all the veterans. Okay, Memorial Day, the History Center will be open after the parade and all of the ceremonies in Library Park. Well, see Library Park? It used to be called Library Park. Now it's Veterans Memorial Park, where I was just talking about. And I do want to recognize a few people today. We have the Grand Marshal from the Springfest parade right here with us, Doug Sorrell. And his wife, Diana.
Go Diana!
Yeah!
How many of you went to the Springfest this year? Okay, the two organizers of the Springfest are here, Dan and Devin Douglas, very alliterative people.
Yep.
So let's give them a big hand. And you know that, I hear you're already planning next year?
Absolutely.
Okay, I was going to tell you, you want to keep your phone handy because someone's going to be calling you to get it ready for next year. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks to the city for putting together the Riverfront Park. If you have not been there, again, this is Miamisburg. We name things very literally. The park is by the riverfront. Okay? When we built the library in 1909, in the old city park, it became Library Park. So now it's the Veterans Memorial Park because that's where we remember our veterans. We're very to the point here. We're going to be walking up and down Linden Avenue. It used to be called Bridge Street because if you went that way, you crossed the river on a bridge. We're very, very much to the point here. Okay, so does everyone know why Linden Avenue is called Millionaires Row?
Millionaires live there.
Because it's a row of houses where millionaires live. Our society vice president, Terry Scudleri, puts these together. She does a lot of work, and I keep coming up with new tours to keep her busy, to keep doing research, to create more of these pamphlets. But she does a fantastic job. And this year, as you can see, if you were on Main Street, now we're on Millionaires Row, they're color-coded, right? So we have a blue one and we have a green one. More colors are coming because there are 5 tours that we're doing this year. Okay, so originally the building that was standing here was
High school.
Bell High School, that's right.
South building.
There you go. And who are the Miamisburg graduates here? Okay. And you all graduated from this high school here?
Well, the north building. Yeah.
Repeatedly.
Okay. Repeatedly. All right, before then, this area all through here was pasture. So some of these houses we're going to be looking at today were the first ones to be this side of the railroad tracks, because this would have been, even as recently as the 1860s, out of town.
Mm-hmm.
So the first house we're going to look at is just on the other side of the library property, so let us head west. house on our tour is from Judge Michael Cassidy. His son was one of the mayors of Miamisburg back in the 1870s. This house was built in the 1850s, and of course the judge was. Do we have any attorneys in the group? Okay, Martha's an attorney. She's in the group. So we can talk freely about attorneys. Well, I want to know up ahead, because they might sue me. All right, he was an attorney. Also, as I said, mayor of Miamisburg. As you can read here, many of the people we're going to be talking about were investors in each other's businesses. So Cassidy is one of those people. And many of the people we're going to be talking about today have no relation in this part of Ohio that tobacco would be a big deal. But it turns out that this land, when settlers first came here, the soil was rich enough that you could grow tobacco for pipes and cigars, not cigarettes. All the years I smoked, I had no idea there were different kinds of tobacco. So they grew cigar and pipe tobacco here. One of the reasons why, other than the Surgeon General's warning in the 1960s, one of the reasons why tobacco is not a business here in Miamisburg anymore is soldiers in World War I were in France, where the French would roll their tobacco in cigarettes. So they started smoking cigarettes over in France, and when they came home, they wanted to continue smoking cigarettes. We don't grow that kind of tobacco here, so there were tobacco warehouses and business here up into the 1960s, but they couldn't stay in business for a number of reasons, so we don't grow tobacco here anymore. But at one time, there were many tobacco farms in this area. Developed a strain of tobacco that is still sold today. So if you're in the market for tobacco and you see Zimmer's Spanish, it's still being sold, and it was developed here in Miamisburg. All right, moving on. This house was bought by the guy who built the house next door, and that's why you have the same. This was all a single property at one time, and that's why this iron gate goes all the way down to the corner, is because these houses used to be on one property. So let's move on down the street to the next house, which is now a bed and breakfast. The brush with celebrity. There is Councilman Ryan Colvin right there.
Who wants to be a millionaire?
So you can see he doesn't just go to meetings, he's actually out in the community serving. Okay, this house, turning the page. Yes, this is actually one of the newer houses. It's actually only built in 1924, so barely 100 years old. Hardly belongs on the tour. Anyway, this house was built by William Scheibel, who was a toy manufacturer. Now, there was a toy warehouse here in Miamisburg at a toy company. Anybody ever play with toys from Miamisburg? Okay, that's probably why the company isn't there now. But Scheibel did not. He owned a business in Dayton, not the one here in town. And I will show you where that warehouse is. That's part of the bonus of this morning's tours. I'll show you where the toy warehouse is. But this was originally a single-family home. Of course, for many years, it's been a bed and breakfast. And the new name of it is the Buttonwood Inn. Now, does anyone know what a buttonwood tree is? Okay, who are the arborists this morning? No attorneys and no arborists, okay. A buttonwood tree is a sycamore. Okay, now at one time, according to your brochure here, there was a pool in the front yard, and I'm guessing it was probably right here. Now it says in the brochure that the police asked the family to take out the pool that was in the front yard out of concern for the safety of the kids who were going to school. But let me ask you something. Those of us with kids, especially young school-age kids, would you have worried about the safety of the kids if there was a pool on their route to school? Or would you worry more about them just jumping in the pool and getting all messed up before they went to school?
Or not going to school.
I don't think we were really worried about their safety. Anyway, they took out the pool. So that used to be, I'm guessing, right here. And here. Good morning. Well, really good. Glad to be here.
This is an Airbnb, so we just rented it for the weekend.
Oh, great.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's on the, look it up. It's called Buttonwood Inn. It's on the Airbnb. You can rent the whole house. We had a family reunion, so we got the whole house, or you can get individual. There's 6 individual rooms. It's wonderful.
Wow.
Please stay here. Molly is the owner, and she's wonderful.
Wow.
Have fun, you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, only the rest of the tour I think is commercial free, but really, this is a beautiful building. And if you have an event, this would be a place to have it. If you want to come stay in town, if you're from out of town, or you just don't want to stay in your house in Miamisburg, you want to stay here instead, this is a beautiful place. Certainly worth coming in. So, let us move on to, yes, Charles Bookwalter. 439 East Linden, that way. I want to be respectful here. We didn't actually tell them we were coming today. All right. When you are talking about the history of Miamisburg, one of the names that comes up quite a bit is Bookwalter. The family is actually buried out at Hillgrove Cemetery with so many of the founders of the city, which we'll talk about more on the Hillgrove tour, which we'll be doing later this year. Anyway, so this house was built around 1865, shortly after the Civil War, obviously. And Daniel Bookwalter started the Bookwalter Hub and Spoke Factory. For those of you who don't know, we had 2 big carriage companies here. One was the Kaufman Buggy Company, which was north of town. That area has been completely rebuilt and rearranged after the 1913 flood, which pretty much wiped out that factory there. Besides the fact that carriages were not that popular after the turn of the century, given that Henry Ford was doing so well with his vehicle, and the few car companies that have tried to start up in Miamisburg were just taking pretty much a horse carriage, putting a motor in it, and trying to sell that with the high wooden wheels, and that just wasn't what people were wanting to buy. All right, so the other company was called Enterprise. It was on Pearl Street, just across the railroad tracks, and that building is, for the most part, not there anymore. The Kaufman Company, the Kaufmans were investors and also executives for the Enterprise Company as well. So they, I believe the way it worked out is they made the chassis at Kaufman and then put the carriage on at Enterprise, but then Enterprise later on, the building was bought by the Wright Airplane Company. So we used to make parts for the Wright brothers airplanes here, not the one that flew at Kitty Hawk. They were still building their stuff at home. But after they started making airplanes, they needed factories. This was one of them. And what they used to do here, probably in addition to other things, is they would make the propellers here. And the wood that they found that was the most useful or the most conducive to being a propeller was white oak. Now you'll notice, if you know anything about trees, that there are not a lot of white oak trees left in this immediate area. It's because the Wright brothers were paying up to $5,000 per tree for the white oaks, and they bought all the white oak trees they could find to make propellers for their airplanes. It has to be a sturdy kind of wood. I don't know a lot about airplanes, but I do know you want the propeller on the plane from the start to the finish of your flight. So white oak is very good for that. Now, there is one place in this area where a farmer said he will donate the land to Miami Township if bless you. If they don't sell the trees to those Wright brothers. Right? And if you know on 741 across from MetLife, there's the, what's that park called? Walroot? Yeah. There are white oak trees there because the farmer said, I will give you this land if you keep it out of the hands of the Wright brothers. So there are still some white oak trees left, but only in that one area down in Miami Township. Questions so far? One of our great city fathers right here lived in this house. We want to go down to the railroad tracks and then stop. So let us progress west. Okay, this was the home of Dr. Glenn Snyder. He was a doctor here in town for 46 years. Originally he had a doctor's office over on Main Street. Then he moved his office over to Central Avenue. And actually, this is something that this house was moved from Central Avenue to this spot when he bought this lot. Now, during his career, he delivered 2,780 babies. Some of them probably in this front room. How many of you know relatives not born in the hospital? Anyhow, Dr. Snyder was involved in the community. He was involved in all the Masonic groups here in town. He was also an advisor to Team LA, which is the young men's organization. He was active in the Rotary, the Rotarians here. Wow, we really need to advertise. He was an active Rotarian for many years, secretary of the organization here in town. Just a great community spirit in person, and made Miamisburg his home. Delivered most of the generation, I would say. So, Dr. Snyder's home right here in his office with his armory. Okay, everything I said actually walked across the street.
Oh, not one.
No, please, that's what I need to hear. Anyway, that's the house that got moved. Okay, to the best of my knowledge, this is David Hoover's house.
Send you back to school.
I trust you.
You know I'm volunteering, right? No, thank you. This is how you learn. When you're talking about the history of Miamisburg, if you don't come across a Hoover, then you're not looking enough into the history of Miamisburg. David Hoover, interestingly enough, now our friend Tim Gaffney here, who's writing a book about Miamisburg beer. Big round of applause for Miamisburg beer. As I said, Franklin built all the churches and Miamisburg built all the breweries. So you sinned on Saturday, you went down the canal, and you went to church on Sunday. Just a quick side note, the first Methodist circuit riders came through when we just had the stockade on the other side of the river, when it was called Hull Station, many, many years ago. And according to the church records, I'm not even making this up, according to the church records, they said they were spectacularly unsuccessful. So obviously the Methodists did better in later years, but when they first came to town, no one was interested. So they opened breweries instead. David Hoover actually has an interesting footnote in history because his brewery was not successful, which doesn't make any sense. Later, he went into some other businesses, including he made a reaper and binder machine because there were a lot of farms around here, and you want to do as little as possible by hand if you can invent a machine to do the work for you. Now, I printed off some things here from Tim Gaffney, so he's going to tell me if I'm doing this right. And this is part of the bonus part of the tour, okay? All right, the first thing that Hoover tried was a brewery. That didn't work, which doesn't make any sense in Miamisburg. Again, just as a side note, on Main Street, this is Linden Avenue, 1 block over is Central Avenue, and in that area on Main Street, at one time, there were over 30 bars.
Mm-hmm.
Shock, dismay. Now, some of them have burnt down, and if you look, I mean, but many of them are still there because it is Miamisburg. You know, a lot of Germans from Berks County in Pennsylvania. They brought their skill set. And if you look, you can see the Linden Avenue Bridge from here. And just on this side of the bridge, just as you're coming into Miamisburg, there used to be a bar right there. And it was called, and I have photos of this, what we do in the Historical Society records. It was called the First Chance. And as you came into town, as I said, on Main Street, you had 30 more chances. So, all right, so David Hoover got out of the brewing business and started making a grain separator with Joseph Watson in the 1840s. Then he bought him out. Then his son joined the business, and then they started manufacturing Excelsior reapers and mowers, which was a mower that was pulled behind a horse. So it was very popular, and it was made here in town. It was not invented here in town, but was manufactured here for many years. Where did they do it? In that building right there behind the doctor's office. So originally that warehouse was where Hoover had his business. So you can see, I mean, if you're going to be a business owner, that's a great way to supervise your business when you can just look out the living room window. And then later on, his son-in-law went into business with him, and then William Gamble, another son-in-law, went into business. And then as Hoover died and then Allen died, then Gamble bought the business out, and we'll talk about William Gamble here in a little bit as we get back up the street. But Hoover was, again, as I said, one of those names that you have to know if you know anything about Miamisburg. So he made the machinery here, but then down on 2nd Street where Lucky Star Brewery is, what do you know, a brewery on 2nd Street, that is where they made the twine and the binding to go into the reaping machines. So he had to walk, 1 block that way to supervise his other business. Any questions about David Hoover? I swear his house is right here.
309.
Okay, let's move next. The home of Elizabeth Weaver Black Trion.
Yep.
Now, she was originally married to a man named Hezekiah Black, and I think you'll agree with me, we need to bring the name Hezekiah back, am I right? That's a cool name. And Hezekiah ran the Miami House. Now, back in the early days of Miamisburg, all of the hotels were named the something house. Okay? So the Miami House is where Jane's on Main is now, and if you remember years ago, it was the Star City Cleaner. Before then, it was originally the Miami House Hotel, which was right there on it was close to the canal, it was close to the river, it was close to the railroad tracks. So the first railroad station, this is the new track here. The original station is across the river in a town that was called Bridgeport before it was all washed down the river in the 1913 flood. Now it's part of Miamisburg, but that station over there is still there, and that's the original track that went into the Miamisburg area. Now, we all know the Baum Opera House, right, on 1st Street? He also had a hotel, which he cleverly named the Baum House. And he used to offer the additional service of taking a carriage across the river, and he would pick you up at the train station and bring you back over to his hotel. So that was another one of his claims to fame, other than the Opera House, which of course is still here. So Elizabeth Trion was married to one of the founders of the city, John Trion. She was his second wife. After Hezekiah died, left her all of his estate and everything. She married John Trion. John was in his 80s by then and widowed also. And they lived in that house right there. Now, for some reason, after he died, this house was built sometime turn of the century, about 1900 to 1910. For some reason, she moved over here with her daughter from her first marriage. And I don't know what the story on that is. We'll probably never know, but for some reason, not only did she move out of the house here, but John Trion is buried at the top of the hill in Hillgrove Cemetery, and she's buried out in Moraine with the Weavers. So I'm not starting any rumors or anything, but I don't know, something happened. Anyway, when she died, she was one of the wealthiest women in this area and probably in the United States. She left an estate of $2 million in 1915. So you ask yourself, how much would that be worth today? And somebody was on the internet this morning. $61 million. Yes, very prosperous. Owned a lot of land. I mean, Trion at one time owned 10,000 acres in this area. He owned the Miamisburg Mountain. You know, this whole area through here. Even though it was pasture, I mean, he slowly sold the lots, made a fortune. Plus, he was a doctor, so you know, he overbilled Medicaid. And speaking of John Trion, let's go across 3rd Street here, and we will talk about his house. Art and Jacob Kircher founded Miamisburg in 1818. They had a bunch of lots of, I think they were like a 1/5 acre, they're very small lots, and the original part of Miamisburg would be over in this direction from where we are now. And they sold those 90 lots at a public auction, and that was the beginning of Miamisburg. So, John Trion was actually a veteran of the War of 1812, where he was a surgeon in the Army. If you know anything about the history of the War of 1812, that was probably a pretty gruesome job, because well, the British pretty much won every battle, so it didn't go well for the United States. Okay, but then Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, and we all ended on a high note. So it does have a happy ending. Anyway, John Trion came here. He had maybe 50 cents in his pocket, and he still owed money on the horse he was riding in on. There's probably some joke about that. But he became a very successful doctor, practiced medicine for 65 years. He lived into his mid-90s when he died in 1887. I mean, imagine that. Anyone living that long, even today, but he lived that long and died in 1887 at this house. Now, he practiced medicine for that many years. He specialized in thyroid, goiters and things like that, but he was a traveling doctor and treated the natives as well as the settlers equally. So he took his Hippocratic oath seriously. Now, in his memorial book, which we have copies for sale at the Historical Society, so it's not completely commercial free, is it? It says that even late in life, late in his career, he still amputated a man's limb with proficiency. So, So, yeah, again, was he a good doctor? Let's hope so, but you know, medicine back then was a little bit more primitive than it is today. All right, now this house, it was a smaller home, and then he added to it, and one of these sides is older than the other, and of course the roof was added many years later. Now at the very top, you see the iron grating there, right? Does anyone know what that feature is called? It's a square up there. It's a widow's walk. That's right. Usually, you find these in coastal towns because that's where women would go up on the top of the house to look out to see if their men were coming home from ocean voyages or battles at sea. From that widow's walk, I don't even think you can see the river clearly. So, not really sure why we have a widow's walk in Miamisburg, but there it is. And I don't know that, I mean, given the fact that Elizabeth was buried somewhere else, besides where he was. I don't know that she was on the roof looking for him, so maybe they got a deal. I don't know. All right, questions about John Trion. We will also talk about him at the Hillgrove Cemetery tour, because he gave the land to he was on the cemetery board when it founded in the 1860s, and that was his land at the time, so they made the cemetery out there. And so that's why he has the most prominent spot at the very top of the tallest hill. So he was obviously humble. And if you look at his, he's got a big pillar there with his face on it. The only one in the cemetery where it has an image of him on the stone. So obviously a humble man. So we'll talk about that more on the tour. Interesting note, though, this is something that we just discovered recently. You know, as you build a town, you put your cemetery outside of town, because you don't want to have a cemetery in the middle of your small community. So originally, the cemetery was on the north side of town, but then as the canal came in the 1820s, and the city, which was of course still a town, village, expanded westward, or eastward, I'm sorry, they relocated the cemetery to what's Library Park. Okay? Now, the problem is, and happily, I hope none of you have had to relocate a relative, but if you didn't have enough money to disinter your relative, you just picked up the stone and took it to the next cemetery and put it in a plot. So, are there still people waiting for Judgment Day in Library Park? Yeah, probably. One of them they discovered in the 1960s when they put in the fountain. As they were digging the water line, they hit a metal coffin and dug it up, and it was one of those human form fitting metal coffins, probably very expensive. There was a glass window in it where you could look down into the box. It was down at Bell Memorial for several months, and I know guys who went down there every day with their school friends to check it out. There was like a line of people, from what I understand, who wanted to check out the old coffin. From the way that he looked, from, again, my secondhand information, said he was a pretty well dressed guy and pretty well preserved. So, but now he's buried up at Highland Cemetery, which is the cemetery on top of the hill. So I don't know why they didn't take him to Hillgrove, but, well, for one reason, that's when
Bell families who started the cemetery over there, and they had the coffin. So that's why they put him over there.
There you go. If you've got the coffin, it goes in your cemetery.
Yeah.
Been almost 200 years, so
Right.
a few things have changed.
Yes.
Now it is apartments and some residences here, and of course the apartments on the back were added later on. Trion had a house here as well where he had his practice, and that house, because that's what we did back then, that house has been moved to South Miami Street, which is just next to the river that direction. So Trion's house is still here, but that's a little bit outside of our tour this morning. Any other? All right, across the street is the home of Thomas Bernard Lyons. Again, that's another name that should come back. Bernard, along with Hezekiah. He was a doctor here in town. He was also mayor in the 1850s. And bought the lot for, wow, $2,000. So he was a respected physician. Obviously, he was a physician with a couple of dollars too, because $2,000 back then would have been a lot of money. Okay, so again, he was a physician, but also he was an investor. As you can see, he started the Ohio Paper Company, the Miamisburg Binder, Twine, and Cordage Company, and he was also instrumental in organizing 2 banks here in town. So that's probably part of the respect he had as a physician, is he had all the money too. His son was a president of the Enterprise Carriage Company, which was the one I mentioned earlier on Pearl Street, which we'll be talking about on our North Miamisburg tour. And then his son became president of the First National Bank, which was originally the Citizens National Bank. And we'll talk about his house in a little bit, but Thomas Bernard Lyons Jr. was elected mayor in 1912. So you know what that means. He was the mayor during the flood. That's just bad luck. So we'll talk about him. His house is up further past where the floodwaters came in, but of course this house right here would have been right in the middle of the flood. The water in this area was 6 to 8 feet deep. And you know, one thing to think about when you're thinking about the greatest natural disaster in Ohio history, it isn't just the water, it's all the stuff that floats down in the water. So you've got, you know, you can't really float in it because you might get hit by a tree limb or when the water flooded into Dayton, there was a, you know, the levee failed up in Dayton. That's the physical levee, not the bond issue. When the levee failed in Dayton, it flooded in about 8 to 10 trillion gallons of water. And one of the things that happened is it flooded out a railroad car building company. So there were railroad cars rolling down through the streets of Dayton at the time. So all that devastation, all that broken stuff would have washed down the river to here in Miamisburg. And at the time, the Big Four, as they were called, railroad, had built a big embankment on this side of the river for the railroad bridge that went across the river. The problem was that caused the bottleneck of all that debris after it had knocked out the bridges, and it backed up all the water back into Miamisburg a second time. So we were one of the most damaged towns per capita of any town that was damaged by the flood. And it was statewide. I mean, eastern Ohio had more damage, northern Ohio, but mostly it was the western side of Ohio that had the greatest destruction, particularly from Dayton south. This house would have been damaged in the flood, but I can tell you, and speaking of car accidents, it was several years ago. It was on St. Patrick's Day. Like we needed another excuse to go to a ale house in Miamisburg. But I was at a meeting here up the street, heard this big crash, and when we came out of the meeting, there was a car that had mashed the front end of it right here into the Lyons house. The car was destroyed, a little bit of the landscaping was damaged, house was untouched. So not only is it flood proof, but it's also car accident proof, because it, well, of course they did a little, you know, cosmetic fixing. But anyway, this house was for sale about how many years ago? Was that 5 years ago?
Yeah,
About that? Yeah. I came very close to buying it. The only thing that stopped me
money.
was about $400,000.
Yeah, it was
That close. Beautiful home. About 400 and change. You know, once you get over 400,000, you're getting into some real money, you know. One time, this was the home and the practice of Dr. Joseph Weaver. So, if you remember from about 20 minutes ago, Elizabeth Weaver, Black Trion, had the house across the street. This was her brother's house. She bought the lot from him, and then he had bought this lot from Isaac Trion, who is John Trion's brother, who was also a doctor and an investor here in town. Property owner, tobacco guy, the whole deal. So, you know, it's who you know, right?
Right.
Even back then. Okay, so Dr. Weaver was here for many years. Again, Weaver is one of those names. You'll see a lot of middle names of famous Miamisburgians, Miamisburgers. What are we called? Hillbillies? Yeah. Well, we got pavement and everything now, so. Weaver is one of those names that you'll see quite a bit, along with Trion, Bookwalter, and some of the other names we've mentioned today. Again, he also, you know, in addition to being a doctor, he also had a lumber and coal business, and he dealt in real estate. So there you go. And died in 1904 at the age of 88. So it was something about being a doctor here in Miamisburg that just lengthened your life. Now, I don't have any stories about him sawing off limbs when he was in his 80s, but let's hope he didn't. Anyway, this was later bought by Dr. Eagle, who had his dental office, and then there were apartments upstairs.
Mm-hmm.
Did anybody here go to Dr. Eagle as a dentist? Okay. From across the street?
Yep.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Convenient.
Do you know why they call this Linden Avenue?
Well, because there should be linden trees here, along with Maple Street and all the other street names. Second Street used to be called Locust Street. Central Avenue used to be called Market Street, which is why at the end of it you had Market Square.
Car that the Historical Society owned was originally bought by Lee Eagle's family down here where Master's Insurance was, and that's where it stayed in that family for decades.
Okay. I won't say if, I'll say when you all visit the Miamisburg History Center, which is just over here on 5th Street, Wednesdays and Saturdays from 1 to 4 or by appointment. You will see that we have an Overland automobile. Beautiful car, built around 1917. The car lot was down where Masters Insurance is on 1st Street, and Dr. Eagle and his family bought that car. That car has not left Miamisburg since, unless they drove it out of town and then brought it back. So the car is a Miamisburg resident as well. Beautiful car. We do take it out occasionally for parades, but insurance is kind of steep for a beautiful old car. The last thing we want to do is drive it into Thomas Lyon's house or something. Anyway, the car is there on display. Beautiful vehicle, but it has never left Miamisburg. So it wasn't built here, but it's been here as long as any of the families have. Civil War. He was in fact not 9 years old when he was captured. He was actually, looks like he was 18 years old. Now it says here, they captured in September of 1862. So, does anybody know what was going on in the Civil War in September of 1862? Okay, I'll tell you. September of 1862 was the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, is what they called it in the South. And it was the bloodiest day in American history. So it's not surprising if he was there that he would have been, first of all, wounded twice, and then captured. So it's possible he could have been at Antietam. He was released in 1862 in December. And then, just like so many of our city fathers, he became a tobacco agent and then got into real estate. So, and then he was also active in the National Guard. His wife was active in a number of organizations as well. And that would have been during Reconstruction, which ended about 1876. So that's when a lot of people were involved and more interested in Reconstruction. Now, another interesting fact about this house, and when I say fact, I'm pretty sure that I'm telling you the truth this time. When the Mound facility was in operation, this house here had a bunch of rooms where the scientists used to board. Now, I know this for a fact because one of the last tours I was doing, I was standing here like this and everyone was looking up, and I thought, wow, it really fascinated everybody. They're really looking at this house. And then I looked back over my shoulder and the owner was actually looking out the window at me through an open window, and he was nodding his head as I was telling the crowd that there are still numbers on the door from where the boarding rooms used to be. So this used to be a boarding house.
He's over here on the right, around the corner.
Hey, welcome back. See, this part of the tour is true. Okay, so this is kind of a nice change for me. Anyhow, any questions about Major Bowls? this house was built in 1883, and again, one of those names that you'll come across in Miamisburg history is Pansing. He was an undertaker, a cabinet maker, and a furniture dealer. Probably not in that order, but a lot of, on our 2nd Street tour, we talked about the Bruff family, who still has a funeral home on 2nd Street. They started out as a furniture building company, then they were making cabinets, and then they started making coffins. In a time when you used to take a corn stalk out to the home where someone had died, and you would measure the length that you needed for the coffin with a corn stalk. And one of the descendants, I think it was John Bruff, went to Cincinnati and took a course in embalming that lasted 2 weeks, which to me doesn't seem like enough time to really, but again, it was many years ago. So the Bruff Funeral Home is there. Pansing had a funeral home. If you see on Main Street the 2 buildings that say A.R. Stocker, he had a furniture business and a funeral home. He actually started with the Bruff family and then moved on to his own business. The Gephardt Schmidt Funeral Home used to be on Main Street, so you know, one thing you can count on is death and taxes, right? So, excuse me, good business to get into if you can.
Did you mention earlier about a lot of Masons in this town?
Oh my goodness, yes. Does anybody know any Masons in this town? A few of them?
So you know, this man is the master of Minerva Law in Miamisburg, Ohio. It was founded in 1829.
I'm trying to start the class.
How's that for a first?
I thought it was cool.
Didn't hear it. Repeat that.
Oh.
Oh, 2 miles.
Those are the great things.
No, I was past master of Minerva Lodge here on 2nd Street in late 2010. Seems like yesterday.
Oh, nice.
Doug Sorrell is actually a 33rd degree Mason,
Wow.
which is a rare honor. In the Scottish Rite, each valley, each area, each district, or however you want to describe it, will nominate 2 brothers a year to receive the 33rd degree. And because of his community involvement, his fundraising for charities, and his activities in the shrine, and he's a walking commercial for masonry right here. They honored him with that, it's called being coroneted 33rd degree Mason. So his patent is hanging in our Masonic building on 2nd Street. So when we do a tour down there, or an open house, come down and see it. It's this guy right here. Since 1909, there have been 10, including Doug, who have received the 33rd degree. It depends on the
Well, since 1909, for us to have 10, Miamisburg's always had a very strong Masonic tradition. So,
oldest organization in the city.
Came in 1909. It was W.A. Ryder, who was a mayor of Miamisburg, and he was the first state legislator from Miamisburg. So he was number 1 in 1909 and coroneted the Valley of Cincinnati. The Valley of Dayton didn't even exist. So there are 3 of those guys that are 33rd from Miamisburg. Scott Lipp, state rep, Jeff Shaw, and myself. Dick Church, recently received names. I think the names that are recognizable have received us.
And there's one of them.
I went in.
No one's got to know.
I went into the Mason building in North County, West Virginia. I thought it was because I'm from Scotland, the Scottish Rite's on it. I
Yeah.
thought it was a lawyer's office. I walked in. They said no. I was talking to some people, and they said no. It started in France. It's called Scottish Rite, but it's studied in France. So I did some research. I found out my family were Freemasons in Scotland too.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Great. That's fantastic. All right, now, Mr. Hansing was also active in the International Order of Oddfellows. Has anyone ever heard of the Oddfellows?
No.
Okay. The Oddfellows are an interesting organization in the 21st century because they own all kinds of property in Ohio and they have very few members. So they have virtually no debt, but no one shows up to the meetings because hardly anybody's an Oddfellow anymore. The lodge over in Germantown still meets. Marion Lodge number 16 that used to meet in the Oddfellows building, which is where Ron's Pizza is, used to meet on the 3rd floor. Actually, the lodge, the Minerva Lodge, used to meet there as well before they bought this building in 1902. That's more of the 2nd Street tour. But the Oddfellows were an organization. Does anyone know why they're called Oddfellows? Thank you. Yes. And there's a shade tree. Yeah. No, they're called Oddfellows because they're one of the first organizations, one, that offered burial insurance policies for their members, which at the time would have cost about $50. I mean, the whole policy would have been worth $50 because that's all it took. But they were one of the first organizations in it. They were also one of the first charitable organizations in existence, at least in the Western world. And that was very unusual for any well-off people to have any interest at all in those less fortunate. So the more well-off community leaders said, what a bunch of odd fellows. The name stuck. So they're similar to the Masons, but they're just not quite as cool as we are.
They're still very prominent in Iowa. Very strong in Iowa.
They are still out there. Attorney, actually he's very well respected. Died young in the late 1800s, and when he died, the Dayton Bar Association had a very big ceremony for him. I think some of the Dayton Bar Association were pallbearers for him at his funeral. His father was Adam Clay, who was again very prominent in the city. Started out in the shoe business and then decided to become an attorney. I have no idea how those two businesses connect, but he became a lawyer, very, very well respected, was a very active Mason, and was also mayor of the city for several years. And then his son, Amos K. Clay, also became an attorney, but he died in his late 40s. Again, it was a sudden tragedy. His grandson, Amos Kendall Clay III, is one of our Historical Society members, and he remembers visiting this house. But he has, I asked him if he was an attorney, but he is not. He went into other business. But his descendants are still here around in the area, and the Clay name is still one of the respected names in Miamisburg. If you get a chance to be in this building, it's beautiful. It still looks like the interior is there, the woodwork is there. It's just a beautiful interior. Unfortunately, the only reason you would be in that building is for funeral service. When William Gamble built this house, I mean, it's very impressive, right? But actually, this is considered a conservative house for someone of his stature. So he didn't spend all of his money on this. Now, William Gamble was the son-in-law of David Hoover, so he got started in business with him and was involved in several businesses, either a stockholder, on the board, so he was very well off. His son, cleverly named William Jr., one of the other big names in town who didn't have a house here on Linden Avenue or Drive was Charles Allen. And he was very active in the Methodist Episcopal Church, also an active Mason, city leader, Civil War veteran. We have his letters home to his wife in our collection at the Historical Society. Open Wednesdays and Saturdays from 1 to 4. And the gift shop will be open too. The cloth outside was water treated and the boat did float. They were very, very popular. They were in the Montgomery Ward catalog for many years, around the turn of the century. There were Acme floating boats that have been found in abandoned gold camps in the Yukon. We have a letter somewhere in our archive, and we're organizing, I hope we'll dig it up someday soon, from a Russian noble or somebody who wrote saying that he loved his Acme boat. I'm thinking he wrote in English because we don't have a very big Russian community here in town, so no one will be able to read it. But So active boats were a thing. They were a big deal. And the building where they made them, where they eventually landed, was on Pearl Street, that sort of strange triangular looking building that's right next to the railroad tracks. So that building is still there. But William Gamble Jr., who wasn't quite as active in the community, more of a quiet person who liked to invent stuff, and it wasn't like his father, who was involved in all different sorts of wars and everything. One of the things he used to do was he would practice his piano in the evening in one of the front rooms here with the windows open, and people used to gather on the phone and listen to him play the piano. So that would have been a nice way to spend an evening here.